Hi, I'm the Idiot, and this is The Anatomy of a Scene. So, The Fast and Furious sits at a very special place in my heart. It's a film that I grew up watching a lot of. I could probably go back and watch it right now and quote every scene. And it definitely is a very influential film in my life. It got me into car racing, and it's also the ninth highest grossing film series of all time. So even if you don't think they're good films or you don't like them, there's something that you need to look at if you're trying to get into the film industry as something that definitely can get a lot of people to go into the theaters to see it. And the films only are getting bigger in terms of, how much money they're making, but also in terms of the plot. I think in the most recent film, they're saving the world from some sort of nuclear weapon. And so I thought that if I'm going to do the anatomy of a scene, I'm going to do the best scene in the best Fast and Furious movie, which is obviously the first one. So this film was written by Gary Scott Thompson, who essentially read an article about the underground street racing scene in New York and thought that it would be a cool premise for a movie. And so the basic plot follows Brian O'Connor, who's played by Paul Walker, as he's an undercover police agent sent to investigate these truck jackings where a group of underground street racers have been hijacking these trucks full of electronics and then selling whatever's inside. And he kind of discovers this whole world, and he meets Dominic Toretto, played by Vin Diesel, and becomes part of his family. And so over the course of the film, Brian O'Connor is kind of battling with his duty as a police officer, but then also, the friendships that he's made with these people, and it comes to kind of a head at the end of the film, which, if you haven't seen it, you obviously should. So the scene we have today is called 10 Seconds or Less, and it's basically Dominic Toretto has invited Brian O'Connor over to his garage to see his dad's old 1970 Dodge Charger. And this scene stands out for me because not only is it a powerful scene in terms of what's going on in the plot, but I think it's one of the best performed and well-written scenes in the entire movie. And if you kind of peel back the surface layer, both of these characters have a lot to lose in this scene. Brian is supposed to be infiltrating this group to see, who's been committing these crimes. So if he does something here to Dom that Dom doesn't like, he will kind of lose out on this opportunity and not be able to continue his mission. But then even beneath that, he really is becoming Dominic's friend. So if he kind of, disappoints Dom in, the way that he reacts to this story, he's going to lose a friend. And they do really become good friends throughout the film. And Dom is being very vulnerable here. This is probably a story that he doesn't share with many people. This probably isn't a place that he takes very many people, but he's chosen to take Brian here to see this car and tell them the story. And I think that this shows that Dom is, being very open with Brian and really wants to see, is Brian a true friend? How will he react when Dom kind of reveals his, inner self? And so Dominic brings him here and he tells him the story about how this was his dad's car, and his dad was a semi-professional race car driver who died in an accident. And then a week later, Dom saw the man who caused the accident and in a kind of fit of rage beats him with a wrench, effectively ending that man's racing career and his own as he gets banned from all of the racetracks in the area. And this does a lot for explaining Dominic's backstory. For one, it shows that his love of cars comes from this relationship with his father. It explains why he kind of is in this criminal world because, he has a past where he went to jail at some point, and also that he can't participate in legal racing, so he has to participate in this illegal street racing. And it explains that his love of car racing comes from the fact that when he's on the track, it's just him in the car. He doesn't have to worry about anything else, not his team, not his store, not his mortgage. And in his own words,
for those 10 seconds or less, I'm free.
So to start breaking down this scene, I thought we would start with cinematography. And so the first shot of this scene is a master shot of the garage. And as a filmmaker, it's a good idea to start any scene with a master shot because it's a good way of showing the audience kind of an overview of the setting and allow them to see the spatial relationships of all of the different, props and the characters. And so when you have people moving in the scene later, different camera angles, the audience doesn't get lost with where we're at, which isn't a huge concern here because they're in such a small space, but a master shot is a good idea nonetheless. And so the second shot is a shot of the engine bay, and this is a good shot because A, it shows us what the topic of this whole scene is about. It's about this car and the story behind it. but it also is a good idea to show this engine bay because it shows how built this car is and how, for most non-car people, they're not going to understand like how this is such a high performance drag racing car from just Dom telling you the stats. I'm pretty sure most people don't know what a drag car should be running on the quarter mile, or what an engine bay of a really fast car is. But with this big blower supercharger and all these tubes and stuff, it really does show the audience of non-car people that this is a very performance focused car. So the next few shots are shot reverse shots, which is basically where you have two people talking and you show one person while they're talking and the next person while they're talking. And it's a pretty standard shot for conversations. A lot of the times they're done over the shoulder, where you can see the side of the head and the shoulder of the person listening. But here they're not, which I'm a fan of. I'm not a huge fan of over the shoulders. It's just kind of a personal thing. So a lot of these are close-up shots, which are good for showing facial expressions because you can see kind of more of the nuanced performance. And then there's a few medium shots, which are good for showing the setting, especially when characters are moving. Like when Dom is walking around the garage, it's a good idea to do more of a medium shot so that you can follow this character through the background rather than being on their face as they move. And so the next big shot is this low-angle zoom shot of Dom as he tells the story of his dad dying. And this shot's pretty good because A, it's a low angle, so it makes the character look taller and more authoritative, which is good while he's telling this story that has such an emotional weight to it. And then B, this zoom adds a good dramatic effect. When you have a zoom in on someone, it's generally for a dramatic type effect here. And what it's doing is it's kind of bringing you into the character and giving you more of a personal relationship with them. And then towards the end of the shot, when he kind of, drops this bomb that his father died, you get a good zoom, on his face, so then you can again see these more nuanced reactions. And so the next shot is a reverse shot of Brian, and where he's kind of looking at this wall, where he's listening to the story but not giving it his full attention. And then he hears that, Dom's father died, and so he turns around. And using a medium shot here is good because you can see the stuff that he's looking at on the wall. And then when, this bomb drops and you see him turn around, it really kind of puts you in the shoes of Brian, where, you're now very invested in this story, just like Brian is. And so having the shot of him turning around and making eye contact with Dom while he says this is important to show that this story does have a lot of gravity and means a lot to both characters. And then the following shot is Dom walking around the garage, and this shot isn't particularly doing anything amazing, but I do like it because you get this overview of the car. It makes the shot more visually interesting. And while Dom is telling this part of the story where he almost killed a man by beating him with a wrench, you can see tools in the background, and it kind of gives you this relation between the objects that are in the background and the story that's being told by Dom. And the next few shots while Dom is finishing up the story are more of shot reverse shots, and they're pretty close up, and so you get these nuanced reactions, especially out of Paul Walker as Brian. You can really see his eyes and this kind of contemplative, listener's look on his face, which really shows you that he's really invested in the story that Dom is telling him. And it's a good idea to do a close-up of him so you get that, you can really look into his eyes and see, what he's feeling emotionally. And to wrap up the scene, they did the final two shots as the same as the first two shots. The master shot of the garage, which is a good idea because, at the beginning you see him open the garage door, and to close out you see him closing the garage door. So it kind of gives the scene a kind of a circular feel. They entered with this setup and, we're kind of closing with the same setup. But the final shot is of the engine bay. And I think this is a really good shot, especially for the reason that now the engine bay has new meaning. Before, we're in the shoes of Brian, where the engine bay to us and the car in general is mostly a look piece. It's like, oh, this looks so cool, look at this awesome car. Whereas when the shot closes, the engine bay now has an entirely new meaning to Brian and the audience, where now it means, all of Dom's past. The car is his dad's. His dad dies. He's been rebuilding it, even though he doesn't drive it, to keep the memory of his dad alive. And so to have the final shot of the scene be the engine bay, I think is a good way to close out the scene and really show the audience, what. So now I want to talk about the mise en scène, which is a fancy French film word to basically mean what we see within the frame, what is going on that we can see visually. And to start, I'm going to talk about the setting. And so the setting for this is just one room in this kind of old wooden garage. And I like that they chose this kind of old wooden garage outside Dom's house, because this would make sense as the place where Dom would rebuild the car, because A, it's close to where he lives, he has access to it, but also we can assume that this is the garage that Dom worked in with his dad. And so, kind of also moving on to the props in the area, you can see that there are old benches and chairs around, and there are trophies on the wall and pictures of Dom's dad. So we can kind of assume that this is the place that Dom got into cars, that this is where he would work on cars with his dad. And so this is good because as the story is about his relationship with racing and his father, it's good to be in the setting where Dom developed this relationship with racing and his father. And so also all the stuff on the walls is interesting to look at. You have all these trophies which show that Dom's dad was obviously a very good race car driver to win all these trophies. You see old rusty tools and also new tools, so you see that Dom has kept a lot of the things that his dad would use to work on the car, but he also has new tools to work on the car because, he's keeping up with it. And I think the benches and chairs are kind of important because it shows that this is not only a place to just, work on the car, but it was also a place to relax. And, for car people, relaxing while you're working on cars or, at least near the car that you're working on is a pretty common thing. And so it helps paint this picture that, Dom and his dad would come out here and work on the car. And then, when they're not working on it, they would just sit down and talk. And it really kind of gives you this image that Dom had a very close relationship with his father within this context of working on cars in the garage. And I think that the biggest set piece of this scene is obviously the car itself. And I've kind of talked about it, and I could talk about this car for hours even without, relating it to the movie. But this car is obviously very important for a number of reasons. But I think one of the biggest things that, some car people might not understand is that this is an old Detroit muscle car. It's a 1970 Dodge Charger with a big V8 Hemi under the hood and a big blower motor, which is very common in drag racing, especially amongst these older V8 powered cars. And so having this old car, I think, is good because it represents the past that Dom is dealing with. He has this new, Mazda RX-7, and Brian has the new Supra. But this old car, represents both the good things in Dom's past, his good memories with his father, but also the bad things in Dom's past, like his father's death. And, the fact that he keeps this car around is to kind of remember both of these things. It's to keep the memory of his father alive, but also remind him that his dad is dead and that he did some horrible things after his father's death. And so moving on to character placement, I think it's something that is very important when directing and making a film, but it's something that not a lot of people watching the film give a lot of mind to. But character placement is very important, and here it's used pretty well. So we start the scene, and Brian and Dom are standing right next to each other looking at the car. And, because the scene starts off with a more lighthearted mood, having the characters next to each other shows that, they're friends and they're close to each other. But as Dom starts to tell the story that is possibly alienating to Brian, he walks away from Brian. He kind of walks around the garage, and you see that there's a distance between these characters. Brian's never killed anybody, or at least never killed anybody in a non-police setting. So, this story could be very distancing for him. And so as Dom walks away from him, this gap between the characters is created. But as the scene finishes and Dom is, pretty certain that Brian has accepted him, the character's distance then closes. Dom walks around the car and approaches Brian, and we get them closer together. And in the scene, they stand next to each other as they leave the garage. And so, going on back to my point earlier about using the same shots, having the characters move in a circular fashion gives this scene a very circular feel and kind of wraps it together. We start a one way and we end a very similar way, but the ending now has new meaning. Where the characters started off close together in the beginning because they're such good friends, it ends because they now have this very almost kind of brotherly bond because of the story that's been told. And to wrap up this breakdown of this scene, I just want to talk about the performances. And that's something that this movie gets a lot of hate for, and I can kind of see why. The performances at many parts aren't the best. The acting is definitely borderline cheesy in some areas. But I think that this scene's acted very well, especially considering that both actors were relatively unknown at this time, so they're really putting in their all to try and give this performance a lot of life. And so let's talk about Dom, because he's the main performer here. He starts off with kind of a jokey tone. You could hear kind of a chuckle in his voice as he mentions, the car used to have so much torque that the chassis would bend coming off the line. But then he gets, this very Vin Diesel thing where he has this very low, gravelly voice as he tells this story. and his volume's kind of low here, you know, showing that he has some guilt. And I think that he acts this scene very well. I think that his performance here definitely shows that this character is battling with some internal demons, and that, you know, when he starts to talk about racing, his tone kind of lets up, and you can see that he really does love racing. And onto Paul Walker's performance as Brian O'Connor, we can see that, you know, he starts the scene in a very similar kind of attitude, more jokey, more friendly. You know, he's like laughing, he's talking about like, man, this car looks great, you know, like, what did it run? But then as the scene continues forward, he really stops talking and he goes into listening mode. And I think he acts really well here for a listener. You know, although he's not speaking, so you can't get the kind of vocal performance, you can definitely see it in his eyes. Like I mentioned earlier with the close-up shots, you can really see in his facial expression and his eyes that he's really paying attention to his story. And you can see that he's got this contemplative, you know, questioning look that kind of turns itself into more of an accepting look at the end. And I think that Paul Walker's acting here is done really heavily through his eyes. And Paul Walker's got some big blue eyes, which really do help with this scene. And so to kind of wrap this all up, Fast and Furious, again, is a movie that I love. I could watch it anytime. You know, if it comes on television, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to watch the whole thing. And I think it's a movie that, you know, isn't looked at as kind of a high art film, but I think that all films have elements, you know, of greatness in them, even if you don't think that they're particularly great. And I think this movie has some pieces in it that definitely make it a great film, and it's one of the reasons why I love it. In The Anatomy of 10 Seconds or Less, a scene from the first Fast and Furious film. I hope that you go back and you watch this movie with kind of a new perspective and you really look out for this scene. But also keep your eye open for other scenes. I mean, there's plenty of scenes in this movie that really do have some good acting, and the movie in general just has really great production value and design. There's a whole video I think that people should watch by Craig Lieberman, who designed and worked on all the cars in the film, that talk about how they use such a small budget to have such a, you know, high action car destruction movie. And I also think you should look out for Chad Lindbergh, who plays Jesse. I think he's a pretty good actor in this movie, and it definitely gives you a look at the type of people that are into racing and how these kind of underground worlds can accept people from various backgrounds. But yeah, that's been the video. If you liked, leave it a like. If you didn't, tell me why in the comments. And if you love Fast and Furious, tell me all about it below. You know, let's start a conversation about how this movie can, you know, change people and make them into car people, because it definitely did that for me. I'll see you guys later.